In the summer of 1859, France, Great Britain, and Egypt worked together to construct the Suez Canal, an engineering marvel that linked the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea and took a week off the voyage around Africa to Europe. 97 years later, Egypt needed funds to construct the Aswan Dam on the Nile River, so the president of Egypt and figurehead of the Arab world, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the vital Suez Canal. With the canal fully under Egyptian control, tolls were set up with all the revenue going towards the construction of the dam. France and Great Britain saw the tolls as a threat to their oil supplies. In 1955, two-thirds of their precious oil passed through the canal. The two countries decided to use military force to hopefully revert Egypt's actions and return the canal to the international waterway it was originally meant to be. Egypt's neighbor Israel saw this as an opportunity to take down Arab leader Gamal Nasser, who they considered a threat to their national security, and joined France and Britain in the attack. Diplomatic relations between countries were tested for the 6 months the canal was overtaken. Just days after the attack started, the United Nations called a special emergency meeting and debated on how to end the growing problem in Egypt. This is the Suez Canal crisis. The Suez Canal crisis is considered the Second Arab-Israel War. Before diving into what happened, it's important to understand both the relationships between the Arab and Jewish people and what happened in the tragic First Arab-Israel War. After the hard-fought and tragic World War I, British soldiers took over Palestine. Palestine was a country in the Middle East that had a large Arab population and a small Jewish population, both claiming Palestine as their ancestral home. While World War II was being fought, many Jewish families needed a safe place to go, and their ancestral homeland seemed like the perfect place. Soon, more Jewish people were living there than Arab people, with slowly rising tensions. To hopefully subdue these tensions, the United Nations had a vote on whether or not to split Palestine into two separate countries, giving one half to the Arab people and the other half to the Jewish people. The idea was accepted by the Jewish people, but opposed by the Arab people of Palestine, causing the First Arab-Israel War to begin. 9 months later, Jewish forces took over and Israel was born. The attack on the Suez Canal was considered the Second Arab-Israel War and marked the first time that the Arab and Jewish forces fought since the creation of Israel. The Suez Canal crisis would be remembered for how it continued the dispute between the two opposing beliefs. In September of 1955, Egypt signed an arms deal with the Soviet Union, giving them $88 million worth of Soviet-made military equipment. The Soviet Union was trying to gain more of an influence in the Middle East, and helping Egypt seemed like the best way to start. At this point, the Cold War had been going on for 8 years. Tensions between the US and Soviet Union were at a high, and the recent move made by the Soviets did not help at all. Because of both the Cold War and the arms deal, the US decided to use its checkbook as a weapon against both Egypt and the Soviet Union, and decided not to fund the Aswan Dam project on the Nile River. Egypt was torn, but their leader, Gamal Nasser, found the solution. On the 26th of July, Nasser got in front of the largest crowd any Egyptian president had ever seen and gave a fiery speech. In his speech, he stated that the canal should be fully under Egyptian control, with all the revenue going towards the state. What did Nasser hear back? Nothing but thunderous applause. After he finished, Egyptian forces raided the command buildings on the Suez Canal. Before sunrise, the Suez Canal had been nationalized by Egypt to help fund the Aswan Dam. France started the conversation of a possible joint attack on the canal just after Nasser made the announcement. They were successfully able to convince both Israel and Great Britain to join them after a secret meeting. The three countries planned the attack for 3 months and made sure that it stayed a secret. If the US found out what was going on, they would have stepped in and stopped any attack before it could happen. The conflict started on October 29, 1956, when Israel pushed its troops through Gaza, pushing to the canal and quickly outnumbering the surprised Egyptian troops by October 30th. The Egyptian government was hoping for military aid from the Soviets, but it never came. The British and French troops landed on the north mouth of the canal and took over the ports of Sed and Fawd. US President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious that the British and French launched an attack without the knowledge of the US. Blockades were quickly set up by the Egyptian government to ensure that attackers cannot utilize the canal. This was the first time that the canal had been shut down since its opening, creating large problems for the countries that closed it. The goods that once got to them through the canal no longer had a way to get to them. The French and British noticed the effects but maintained their position on the canal. President Eisenhower, still enraged with the attackers, instructed other U.S. officials to not give any oil to France or Britain and to let them deal with that problem on their own. At this point, other countries throughout the globe realized that they needed to take action, peacefully or not, to hopefully end the crisis. After France and Britain invaded the canal, the Soviet Union threatened Western Europe with nuclear bombs. This had the world in shock. Instead of panicking, the US decided to use diplomatic relations and were able to peacefully direct the Soviets out of doing so. Then came the debates on how to stop the conflict and how to do so peacefully. While the Soviets opted to use force, the US took a different approach. The Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles, started by having diplomatic meetings with both the President of France, Guy Mollet, and the Secretary of Defense for Israel, Moshe Dayan. These meetings got them nowhere close to stopping the conflict. Throughout the crisis, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower was in contact with the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. As the crisis went on, the world realized that they all needed to take action, so the first emergency UN General Assembly was called in New York. The debates went from the 1st to the 10th of November. Nothing came from the first few days of debates, but on the 3rd of November, just 5 days after Israel launched their attack, the Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson, proposed the Canadian Draft Resolution. He proposed the idea of the United Nations Emergency Force, a peacekeeping force that would help to end not just this conflict, but any conflicts in the future. 57 of the members voted for Pearson's solution, while 19 abstained. After the resolution was passed, the United Nations successfully put the team together, and on November 6, 1956, a ceasefire on the Suez Canal was called. The UN peacekeepers were instructed to monitor the ceasefire and ensure that the militaries were attempting to leave combat zones. The mission was considered a success when Britain and France left the Canal Zone in December of 1956. Israel, who was reluctant to leave, left the Canal Zone later, in March of 1957. The diplomacy used between countries helped ensure that the conflict never grew anything further than it did. The debate shown by countries at the first UN Emergency Assembly was a pivotal point in trying to halt not just the Suez Canal crisis, but any potential conflict that the world may face in the future. The war ended with Egypt maintaining full control over the Suez Canal, allowing them to continue utilizing it for profit. The Soviet Union ended up helping to finance the Aswan Dam, and it was constructed soon after. Britain and France noticed the effects of low oil supplies, but they also found that they had lost most of their credit as influences in the Middle East, while the US and Soviet Union found themselves on top. As for the Suez Canal, it would continue to be an important route to get ships to Europe more efficiently. The canal has been shut down a total of 4 times since the crisis in 1956. Today, 13% of the world's trade goes through the canal, creating extremely noticeable effects if it is blocked for any amount of time. Just recently, we have seen these effects when a large ship got stuck in the canal, blocking any other ships from making the voyage. The closing of the canal has catastrophic effects, not just for Egypt, but for any country that has goods transported through the waterway. The crisis in 1956 was no different. The Suez Canal crisis is a perfect example of how debate and diplomacy can be used to solve conflict. Although the conflict only lasted for a few days, around 2,000 casualties were recorded. The outcome could have been very different had the US not diplomatically reached out to the Soviet Union, or if countries had not debated amongst each other on how to handle the conflict. Because of the Suez Canal crisis, we have an effective UN peacekeeping force that is extremely helpful in ending conflicts, an idea of how essential it is to keep important trade routes open, and the knowledge that debate and diplomacy can be used just as efficient, if not more, to ending disputes than war itself.